The importance of working to reduce the threat of nuclear war, as you know, has never been greater, as we know from recent and in some cases very recent developments in this country and in the world. The importance of working to reduce the threat of nuclear war, as you know, has never been greater, as we know from recent and in some cases. I'm hearing a recording. Is Cole, do you hear?
I will, I'm just going to mute everyone so we don't hear any echoes.
Thank you. So we, of course, also know that many of you spend a lot of your time working to achieve the goal of reducing the threat of nuclear weapons. And we want you to know how much we appreciate that. It's so important. So I'm Bob Redwine. I'm a professor of physics at MIT. I'm also the leader of the Nuclear Weapons Education Project at MIT and a member, of course, of the program committee for this conference. Our focus for the conference is on the issues of not only the dangers of nuclear weapons, but also the problems associated with how much the United States is spending on maintaining and upgrading its nuclear arsenal. Certainly, as you will hear, our country has other needs that could benefit greatly from this level of funding. In that regard, I would like to remind people of a term that in the past was much more commonly used than it is presently, that is the military-industrial complex. This was used, especially during the Cold War, to describe the collaboration between military units and commercial units to spend a great deal of federal funds on increasing military capabilities. The motivation of the military units was, of course, to increase their size, capabilities, and importance. On the other hand, the motivation of the commercial units was largely simply to make more money. I think it's interesting to note that the term military-industrial complex was actually first introduced by President Dwight Eisenhower in his closing remarks to the nation as president in January of 1961. His purpose was to warn the nation, as he saw warn the nation of the dangers of the motivation based on money making, as he saw its influence steadily increasing. It's important to remember that President Eisenhower spent much of his career as a very senior military officer. He certainly knew a lot about the details of how the military-industrial complex operated. It's also interesting to note, as some of you may have seen and noted, that President Biden referred to Eisenhower's introduction of the term military-industrial complex in his final address to the nation several days ago. So while we do not hear the term military-industrial complex nearly as often as we used to, it is still very much part of our environment. A big reason we are facing the prospect of spending a huge amount of our resources on upgrading our nuclear arsenal is that some people stand to make a whole lot of money if we do so. This is by no means an appropriate justification for continuing to increase the danger of the annihilation of all life on Earth, and our country must recognize this fact and act on it. To close, I'm sure that this conference will provide us very interesting and important information, and I'm so glad that all of you are attending. Welcome. I will now turn it over to Joseph Gerson, who will chair the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. My name is Joseph Gerson. I'm with the Campaign for Peace, Disarmament, and Common Security, and on the board of Mass Peace Action, as well as other organizations. With our exceptional opening panel and our schedule very tight, I'll keep my introductory remarks to a minimum. This is a moment of extraordinary dangers and contradictions. Our constitutional democracy is under siege by the president and his minions, and millions of our neighbors are threatened with deportations. With China increasing its nuclear arsenal, we are now 3 scorpions in a bottle. Trump is seeking to increase the U.S. military budget by more than $100 billion, including for the nuclear arsenal, and he has threatened to renew nuclear weapons testing at the same time that Moscow has lowered its threshold for nuclear weapons use. At the same time, one of Trump's perhaps greatest driving goal is to win the Nobel Peace Prize for himself. And he signaled an openness to arms control negotiation with Putin and Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So this is a time of fluidity, danger, and opportunity. Before introducing our speakers, let me just say that they will speak briefly. We'll hopefully have a couple of minutes after each of their talks for Q&A, and I'll do my best to identify them. But please, no comments, but just questions. With that, let me then, I'll run through all of our four speakers, and then they'll take the floor one at a time. George Beebe is Director of Grand Strategy at the Quincy Institute. He spent more than 2 decades in government as an intelligence analyst, diplomat, and policy advisor, including as Director of the CIA's Russia Analysis, the Director of the CIA's Open Source Center, and as a staff advisor on Russia matters to then Vice President Cheney. His book, The Russia Trap, warned how the United States and Russia could stumble into a dangerous military confrontation. Prior to joining the Quincy Institute, George was Vice President and Director of Studies at the Center for the National Interest. I'll go on and introduce the others as well now. Lyle Goldstein, and just I've had the pleasure of working with each of these speakers in the past. Lyle is the Director of China Initiative and visiting professor at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. There he investigates the cost of great power competition with both China and Russia in association with the Cost of War Project. He also serves concurrently as Director of Asia Engagement at the Washington think tank Defense Priorities, which advocates for realism and restraint in defense policy. In this role, he is overseeing a range of studies that evaluate U.S. foreign and defense strategies in the Asia-Pacific region. Sharon Dolev, who's joining us from Portugal, is an Israeli peace and human rights activist who focuses on eliminating weapons of mass destruction from the Middle East. She does this through innovations in education, advocacy, and activism to change public policies. She is the founder and director of the Israeli Disarmament Movement and co-founder and executive director of the Middle East Treaty Organization. She also worked for a time with the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which won the Nobel Peace Prize. Imad Kaye is the author of Middle East Weapons of Mass Destruction, A New Approach to Nonproliferation. He is director at the Middle East Treaty Organization, which seeks to eradicate all weapons of mass destruction from the Middle East through innovative policy, advocacy, and educational programs. Formerly, he was a researcher at Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and an associate at Columbia University Center for International Conflict Resolution. Ahmad served as the executive director of the American Iran Council, a nonprofit and nonpartisan educational organization that focuses on U.S.-Iran relations. So with that, George, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm going to focus my brief remarks on the dangers of escalation between Russia and the United States over Ukraine. And I want to begin by hearkening back to a different former U.S. president. Earlier, we heard about President Eisenhower's warnings about the military-industrial complex. John Kennedy, in one of his final addresses, spoke at American University about some of the lessons that he thought were important to draw from the Cuban Missile Crisis and how that played out. And he emphasized that in the nuclear age, the one thing that we should not do is to put ourselves or our adversary in a position where it has to choose between humiliation and the use of nuclear weapons. And unfortunately, I think that kind of position is something that we have been flirting with Russia over Ukraine. And I think part of the reason we've been flirting with it is that we've lost our fear of nuclear war. I think no one will come right out and say that, but I think there's a strong implicit assumption on the part of a lot of Americans these days that the prospect of nuclear conflict is anachronistic. We've been there, we've done that. That happened during the Cold War. We had dangers back then, but the Cold War is over and we don't need to worry about that anymore. because no one is irrational enough to resort to the use of nuclear weapons. It would be suicidal, and therefore we don't really have to worry about that. And you've seen that implicit assumption reflected in a lot of the ways people have talked about what we ought to be doing to support Ukraine against Russia's invasion. The belief that the Russians want us to be scared of nuclear weapons, but we shouldn't, quote unquote, self-deter, because that only gives the Russians greater flexibility, greater ability to carry out their aggression in Ukraine than they ought to have. So a lot of the advice that you hear within the Washington foreign policy establishment about this is, don't be awed by the prospect of nuclear war. It's not really going to happen. We have a lot more room for providing the Ukrainians with abilities to inflict losses on Russia. And you also hear that our goal in this war ought not just to be Ukraine's defense, but also the infliction of a strategic defeat on Russia. And you heard Biden administration officials talking about that repeatedly. Well, when our goal is to inflict a strategic defeat on a nuclear superpower, and when advice coming from Washington foreign policy establishment figures is that we really shouldn't be afraid about the prospects of escalation into nuclear conflict, those should be warning signs that we've forgotten, I think, the very wise advice that John Kennedy offered in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So what do we need to do to avoid escalation into an unwanted nuclear confrontation with Russia? Well, I think one of the things we need to do is to recognize that this is not like the post-Cold War period that the United States enjoyed after the fall of the Berlin Wall up to sometime within the last 5 years or so, when the world really started to change. For much of that post-Cold War period, the United States didn't have a peer rival. There was no chance that we would get into any kind of confrontation with the Russians or the Chinese. They simply were not capable of doing anything to resist what the United States wanted to achieve in the world. And so we focused first on transforming other countries, trying to turn them into liberal democracies. And then after 9/11, we focused on what we thought was a complementary goal, finding terrorists, finding bad guys, and killing them or arresting them. And the habits that we got into during that post-Cold War period, I think, have carried over into this present time when we're facing the prospect of great power conflict. And those habits are ill-suited to the challenge that we face right now. We have to return to the kinds of détente policies, balance of power and balance of interest approaches. In other words, traditional diplomacy meant to contain the prospects for great power conflict, to minimize prospects for escalation. You don't do that by inflicting strategic defeats on a nuclear superpower. You don't do it by trying to foment regime change in these countries. Those approaches are fundamentally destabilizing. So we need to pivot to something new. President Trump has said he wants a settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. I think that is absolutely necessary. The question is, how do you do that? And does Trump understand how you bring that about? That's something that I think people that are interested in avoiding an escalation into a nuclear confrontation with Russia need to think hard about. Personally, I think this is going to mean we have to compromise on one of the issues that the Russians care very much about. And it's not dissimilar to the issue that we cared about during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that is the presence of hostile and very threatening military capabilities near our borders. In the case of Cuba, the United States, I think, rightly judged that the presence of Soviet missiles so close to our shores was a threat that we would not and should not tolerate. The Russians, in the case of Ukraine, have said that the prospect of American military forces on Ukrainian soil that could threaten Russian security is not a prospect that they're willing to live with. The solution in the case of Cuba was a compromise. The Russians agreed that they would not put weapons on Cuban soil that would threaten the United States. The United States, in turn, said that we would remove medium-range missiles from Europe that threatened Russia. In the case of Ukraine, I think we have to be thinking the same kind of compromise. Turning Ukraine into a neutral country, one in which the United States and NATO will not put forces, in return for the Russians conceding that Ukraine has the right and has Russian support for seeking an economic integration with the European Union.
George, I think we have to watch our time here.
Well, I think thanks, Joe. That concludes my remarks on that, and I'll leave it at that. And I'm happy to entertain any questions anyone might have.
Okay, so if people will raise their hand using the react button, I'm hopeful that I can see them. And if I fail to, I'm going to look to, I see Donald Smith has a question. And try and keep it tight.
Okay. Can the establishment agree to oppose the war in U.S. continuing the war in Ukraine without first acknowledging that the U.S. bears responsibility for it in some form, that the U.S. provoked it? And is it sufficient to say, well, it's just too dangerous?
Well, I think in these sorts of diplomatic settlements, you need, as President Kennedy pointed out, to allow everyone to save face. And I think that's the direction we're going to have to go here. The United States does not have to humiliate itself by taking responsibility for this war. I think we merely need to say this war should not have happened. We need to focus on a future that minimizes the prospects for this being repeated. And I think the Russians are not going to take responsibility for something that they obviously should be responsible for. That was the decision actually to invade. So I think what we're probably going to have to do is not focus on pointing fingers and blaming, but focusing on solutions.
Can I follow up? Ask a follow up?
No,
Okay.
real quickly. Jan, can you go very quickly with your question?
My question is, I think the Russians have reneged on agreements with Ukraine, especially about giving up their nukes, and that Russia would protect them, and then they invaded. And I want to know how you analyze that, and if I got it wrong, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. We got watch this time. Go, George.
I think you're referring to the so-called Budapest Memorandum, in which the United States, Russia, and Ukraine agreed that on the one hand, Ukraine would give up the Soviet missiles that were left on its territory after the breakup of the Soviet Union. In return, the United States, Russia, and others would recognize Ukraine's territorial integrity, agree that its borders would not be changed by force, and also agree that Ukraine would be sovereign and not subject to outside political interference. There's a dispute between Russia and the United States over who violated that. The Russians say that when we supported what they thought was a coup d'etat in 2014 that brought a new government into place without elections, that was actually undermining or violating the Budapest Memorandum's pledge of non-interference in Ukraine's domestic affairs. We, of course, think that the invasion also violated that, which it clearly did, but each side has claims that the other did not comply with the terms of that agreement. Regardless of that finger pointing, I think the notion that we can't trust, quote unquote, the Russians to adhere to any kind of deal to end the war is one that I think we need to address by saying, look, we went through this during the Cold War. We had lots of agreements with the Soviet Union, arms control agreements and other things, and we verified them. We didn't simply trust that the Soviets would comply with them out of the goodness of their heart.
George, we've got to save time here for other speakers. I'm sorry to have to be so tight on time. I really apologize.
Understood.
So the next speaker is Lyle Goldstein, Brown University. Lyle, you're on.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much. It's nice to be here. And I certainly agree with everything George just said. He's the best, really. I think if I could have my druthers, he would be our country's national security advisor and figure all this out. Um, I'm just back from China. I gave this lecture actually. I traveled all over East Asia to South Korea as well and Philippines. Um, so I think I have some fresh knowledge. But before I left on my this big Asia trip, I was in. I gave this lecture at Harvard in early December, and yes, that title is very provocative. I know it's not an issue. It's not something I want to normalize, but let me. I would like to take my 6 minutes here and acquaint you with some disturbing things I'm seeing. Okay. First of all, look at this map here. If you can see that on your screen, this is a test, Chinese ICBM test that occurred right into the mid-Pacific in September 2024. So very recently, you probably hardly heard about it, but this is the kind of sad state of U.S.-China relations. The tensions are very high indeed. There was definitely a message in this test. Was it received? It's a good question. This is, let's say, almost unprecedented in the U.S.-China context. So you could see this missile flying from Guam. Actually, there was some video. This is very disturbing, and I'm expecting U.S.-China nuclear rivalry to intensify, unfortunately. But I want to discuss in the Taiwan context. Sorry, having a little trouble with my slides here. Not sure why it won't. Sorry. I'm gonna, sorry. I don't know why the slides are not moving here, but let's try that again. Okay, here we go. And of course I'm reading a lot of Chinese material. And here's a discussion from not too long ago, a Chinese discussion of the book 2034. Some of you may have seen that by famous Admiral Stavridis. By the way, Admiral Stavridis, who was, I think, president of the Fletcher School at Tufts. So he's we know him well in Massachusetts. I think he's speaking at Harvard on the 26th on exactly this issue. But his book was read very carefully in China, and they took on the message that some strategists, including Stavridis, see a U.S.-China war ending with a nuclear exchange. And that is indeed what happened in the book. I encourage you to read it. I don't agree with a lot of what was in there, but that seems somewhat realistic. Maybe we can all attend his lecture at the end of February at Harvard and ask him what he thinks now, or has he reflected on Chinese thinking about this. As I monitor what the Chinese are saying about nuclear risks here, indeed, they are engaged in a major nuclear buildup. No question about that. How to explain it? Well, I think they view us as, if not on the brink of war, but the chance of war as quite high. And they want to deter us, to put it very simply. Look at the title of this article, this phrase, 美国战略机会主义. It talks about U.S. strategic opportunism. What they're talking about there is Taiwan, of course. So that is the nub of the issue. And China thinks it has to build up in a kind of massive way. And indeed, they are digging holes in the desert very, very quickly. So let me, geez, not sure why the slides won't advance. Okay, just to wrap up here, I'm seeing some things that are really disturbing. Here's a discussion saying from a Chinese strategist saying, actually, it's good to have not only equal forces, but have superior forces and the ability to conduct even a surprise strike, that's strategically advantageous. You may remember that from the 80s. What I really want to talk about, though, is some American viewpoints. Here's an American strategist Matthew Kroenig, he's at Georgetown. He's advocating for U.S. first use in a Taiwan scenario. So take a look at this report. It's short and sweet, not sweet. It's terrifying, actually. But this is becoming kind of, when I say normalizing, that's exactly what's going on. Here's another analytical effort also by the Atlantic Council, where they're saying we have to fight through a limited nuclear exchange, that this is well worth it. Taiwan is not Ukraine. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that at all. It's certainly not worth it. That's a ridiculous idea, but I can explain this author is a very powerful individual in Washington. Certainly he was in the Biden administration. And one more study you might want to look at least this one from CNAS, another big think tank, sort of questions this view. It says, hold on a sec, a lot of blue players in our simulations did not want to fight a nuclear war over Taiwan. So this is a little bit reassuring. Take a look yourself. Anyway, I think you get the idea. I'm terribly concerned that we are going down the direction, this dark direction. We've been here before. We made it through once. I don't think there's any guarantee we'll make it through again. Let me just close out here with a few of my recommendations, though. I think we should strive for a P5 annual summit. I think the G2 summit is good too. That is China and the US, but P5 is critically necessary. The tensions on Taiwan continue to boil over. This is a huge risk. We need to do everything we can to calm those tensions down. Some of my measures here are listed. I can go through some of those. I strongly favor no first use. We can talk about that more. A lot of people think it's unrealistic, but I think it would help a lot in these circumstances. And then there are a variety of other measures, including I think China and the US could agree on some things like outlawing this system. You see in the graphic, there is a Russian system they've been working on. I know quite a bit about the Poseidon system. I don't think China wants to see this. The US certainly doesn't want to see this. So this is something we could.
Lyle, you need to move toward wrapping up.
All right. Well, that's it then. That's all I had to say. Sorry about my trouble with my slides here. I'm still having trouble, but please do reach out to me, and like to give this lecture
unmanned
all over.
We have some noise in the background. Lyle, thank you very much, and I expect some of us will be writing to you for access to the slides and other information. Questions? Let me see if I've got anybody with a raised hand here. My computer is so Jeffrey Barklow, you got to keep it tight. I know, Jeffrey, you tend to go long, so try and be real tight.
Yeah, that's totally my bad because I don't know the right words to go. Anyway, why can't the countries with the nuclear weapons come together and create an organization that's only for those that have confirmed nuclear weapons or on the verge of creating nuclear weapons, including Israel, for the purpose of preventing nuclear Armageddon? Why can't we
do it? Thank you, Jeffrey. Lyle?
Well, Jeffrey, it's a good idea. And I think part of what I'm recommending, and I just published an article advocating for this kind of annual P5 summit. I do think the major nuclear powers, who are also the victors of World War II, that they should be meeting very regularly. That would have a very positive effect, including on nuclear arms control. So somehow we don't have that. It seems odd. I mean, we say P5, I'm talking about the permanent members of the Security Council. It seems like such an obvious thing, right? The representatives meet and argue constantly in New York, but let's get the leaders together at least once a year. Probably we need twice a year, where they sit around and talk about arms control and regional conflicts, which is, tearing our world apart.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyle. I'm going to turn to Elaine Scarry for the last question here.
Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I hope we can get the references for us for articles you urged us to read. But I wanted to ask if you had any concrete steps for how the United States could take a more conciliatory view on Taiwan, in the same way that earlier George spoke about possible conciliation on the border of Russia.
Yeah, thank you very much, Elaine. That's exactly what the question I was hoping for, because indeed, Taiwan is the key really to everything, in my view, or anyway, 90% of the problem. because as long as we're on the verge of war, which we basically have been since I would say about 2016, and people ask me, oh, would they really invade? When is it going to be by 2027? And my answer is, it could be tomorrow. They're not going to send a memo saying, here we come. It will be a kind of a shocking surprise. And, if you read Chinese or watch Chinese news, as I do, I watch Chinese military news almost every day. The threats are there. I mean, they've been making very clear that they're ready to go and could go at any time. But to your question, narrowly, just a couple of points. I mean, it seems rather obvious, but back in 1972, our president went on record and said there's one China and we have a one China policy. But somehow over the last, 20 years at least, we sort of started to walk that back, quite steadily. And the Chinese have kept good tabs on it. But it's now, I would say, thoroughly in tatters. That's how I would put it. I can elaborate, but we seem to have a two-China policy. China won't accept that. So we need to go in reverse, try to get back to this one China policy, which, was a great idea. It was a great compromise. It got us where we needed to be, and it probably would, really lower tensions across the Taiwan Strait. I mean, the other thing we can do is reduce our force deployments in the area. I mean, we are exercising at such a high interval now with our forces around Taiwan that hardly a day goes by and every exercise has to be larger than the next. Well, guess what? China's doing the exact same thing, and both sides are really preparing for war now. So,
Well, thank you so much. I hate this.
This is a powder keg. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, and we'll be following up. So then to turn to Sharon Delev, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gershon, for inviting Imad and me to speak here. I will talk, of course, about the Middle East, but the Middle East is not in a bubble, and a nuclear war is something that happens globally. And I think that you can't talk about any of the nuclear armed states without seeing the similarities. We are often talk about logic. It's not logical, and we try to put lots of logic into the conversation, but actually nuclear weapons have no logic. And it's maybe time for us to recognize that. I mean, even when we're talking about the possibilities of nuclear war or how to disarm and how to create a different discourse around them. The first speaker said something about how we forgot to be afraid of nuclear weapons. And I think that this is true. I mean, in the 80s, you could see the fear in the marches that happened. When did we see these kind of marches now against something that is the end of mankind as we know it, but also, with a screwdriver, you take this threat down. You make this threat disassemble, disappear. When we started the campaign in Israel, the ambiguity made it almost impossible to campaign. We didn't even know what we can or cannot say about nuclear weapons. But in 2008, after I heard the first outcome of the research on the humanitarian consequences, then it was called just 100 Hiroshimas. What happens if 100 Hiroshimas will blow up in a limited war between India and Pakistan? The research then showed 2 billion deaths by hunger and between 2 to 10 years of nuclear winter. This campaign, this information was tested in Israel on all the mayors, 240 mayors that were asked to join Mayors for Peace. And from these mayors that never said yes to the invitation to join Mayors for Peace, that only said that cities are not legitimate targets, after we introduced this one-pager showing what 100 Hiroshimas will do, 67 mayors joined Mayors for Peace from Israel, making Israel, funny enough, for several months, the highest percentage of mayors that ever joined Mayors for Peace. The reason I'm telling this story is because I can't stop talking about how the right campaign can make a difference. If we could make cities like the mayor of Dimona, Haifa, and other very important cities and major cities in Israel join Mayors for Peace, even though it's about nuclear weapons, I really believe that the right campaign can work elsewhere. But what worries me is that up till now, there was no one campaign to work with all nuclear armed states where we can campaign with a list of demands and a doable path forward. And sometimes I ask myself if it's because it's hard for us to imagine that it can work. I can say that, especially now, with the escalations, with the massacres in the Middle East, the possibility for nuclear war didn't rise that higher. I mean, if there were 2 times that I was afraid, really afraid, that Israel will use nuclear weapons, it was never about Gaza, because Gaza is too close to us, but it was about when Iran was attacking Israel and Israel got in panic, right? 600 missiles, drones are flying towards Israel. What will Israel do? I think that was the first time, if I can be personal and emotional, I think that was the first time I cried out of fear, because I was afraid of the reaction of the Israeli government to the Iranian missile attack on Israel. And yet nothing happened. We do look at Iran and we look at Israel as the 2 main reasons for a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. However, not just that the nuclear arms race didn't start in the Middle East, all the states in the Middle East, apart from Israel, are taking part in the November conference for a weapon of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. And even though Israel is not there, still 23 states from the Middle East are reaching consensus year after year. And it's kind of remarkable how little support this process is getting and how little mention is getting during the international forums. The reason that I think that it's important is because when we're talking about reducing the chance for nuclear war, after all, it's all about wordings. It's all about disarmament that doesn't start just with the disassembling of the bombs themselves, but by a conversation of disarmament. And in the Middle East Treaty Organization, the one thing that helped us push the states into the November conference room in goodwill was our ability to imagine that it's possible, and then engineering from where we want to be to where we're at now. And my colleague from Iran, Imad, my dear colleague from Iran, will talk about the Iranian side, but I can tell you that I'm still sure that with the right campaign, we will be able to push Israel into this room. Maybe not with this government, right? Maybe not with Netanyahu, probably not with Netanyahu. But, elections will come. It's up to us to put all the components that are needed and to push for, I'm sorry for the C word, for the conditions for such a zone. But it is basically the same in any other nuclear armed state. Imagine the solution and start working towards it.
Thank you, Sharon. We'll go to questions, and thank you for your hopeful message there. Moji Aga.
Hi, thank you. I'll make this very quick. Thank you so much, Sister Sharon from Israel. I am an Iranian American peace and nonviolence activist in Boulder, Colorado. And my comment or question has to do with your views regarding the Samson option I'm sure you're aware of it, and that the normalization by Israel, pushed by Israeli lobby in the so-called civilized North, global North, normalization of a use of nuclear weapons is part of Israel's SAMS option, which is why I am suggesting, and I and others, including inside Iran, are suggesting a a roadmap to global peace agreement regarding, at the center of it is the US and Iran, but also observed by 26 other major
Moji, we've got to
stakeholders.
wrap up, so we've got time for Sharon to
Thank
answer.
you. Thank you. I'll send the link shamelessly advertising in the chat. So thank you. So talk about the
It's
Samsung
okay, she's got it.
option.
She's got it, Moji. Sharon, you're muted.
Well, I'm not sure about how normalizing Samsung option is. Samsung option actually is a different name for the mutual assured destruction, right? Samsung option is just a biblical Hebrew way to say it. But I don't think that it's normalized in a way that people actually talk about it. And that's a reason for ambiguity in Israel. Because if you think that ambiguity is whether Israel is admitting outside that Israel possesses or doesn't possess nuclear weapons, actually the ambiguity is mostly an internal tool. It means that no one in Israel is questioning, nobody in Israel is talking about it. And actually what you saw as a threat on Gaza when Minister Eliyahu, that no one even knew before he said that, talked about nuclear bombs on Gaza, I was actually a bit happy because suddenly people talked about nuclear weapons, how you can't use them, and so on. I mean, it was one of the first times that there was an open conversation about it. So it's not normalization, it's silence. And this is exactly what the campaign in Israel managed to break when we done the humanitarian campaign from 2008 until 2014. In 2014, we realized that the campaign is working good enough for us to move to the next step, which is regional approach that will allow Israel to join once Israel is ready.
Thank you, Sharon. Simply say, each of our speakers here could do a seminar, webinar for several hours. So, but at least we're giving a taste here, and I look forward to everybody finding ways to follow up. Ahmad, you're going to have the last word here. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Cole, and thank you, everybody, for joining. I know that my time is already up before even starting, so I will be as fast as I can. In 3 minutes to mention Iran's perspective in all of this. Let's keep in mind that Iran is not a nuclear weapon state, yet it has come under the most stringent and comprehensive sanctions. And the irony is not lost when Iran has been negotiating with the P5+1, who all possess nuclear weapons either directly or hosting it in European capitals. I'm saying this because at the core of what I actually want to bring across is the hypocrisy in our international system. Is the fact that when we are talking about a global nuclear disarmament, our focus is 9 countries. And then by extension, the nuclear umbrella countries, another 5. And then let's say threshold countries, another few. Let's remember that. And I think the onus is actually on Russia and the United States, possessing more than 92% of the world's nuclear weapons, to actually make progress on that reduction. That has to happen not just bilaterally, but it has to happen as a conviction within the whole group of the nuclear weapon states. And I mean that by including Israel, Pakistan, and India, and North Korea in that whole basket. But rather, I want to also highlight that the agreement that was signed in 2015 that Trump pulled out in 2018, the Iran nuclear deal, gives us a fantastic blueprint, not just for the Iranian case, but for the rest of the region and globally. And the reason why it's so good is that because the Americans wanted Iran's nuclear program to not divert towards weaponization, the level of scrutiny that they went into to close the loopholes on where Iran can actually, run for the bomb, as they would say, has allowed us to actually identify and fill those holes, not just for Iran, but for the rest of the world. In a way, they've done the homework for us because they have such an animosity with Iran that they've actually identified it. So
Yes, Mama.
reviving the Iran
Somebody's got to be
nuclear
muted.
will be paramount. And I think I will go actually with what was mentioned in one of the comments, that in the midst of this, we need Iran-US rapprochement, because that marred relationship has resulted in decades of misunderstanding, of mistrust, and that bridge has to be built. And ironically and sadly, I must admit that with Trump in power, it brings me back to what was mentioned in 1972 with Nixon going to China. We needed a crazy president to be able to break the mold. And I think this one may be actually that crazy to end up going to Iran and making a deal. Because you know what? If he likes deals, the Iranians like deals too. And they've already identified it in all the levels of their leadership, prior and currently, in terms of engaging with the Americans. Thank you.
Ahmad, that was very, very tight, and it does leave us some time for questions. So I'm looking here at my screen to see if questions are coming. Well, I'm not seeing any at the moment, so I'm going to ask you to say a little bit more about the.
There's the emoji.
Let me just ask you to say a little bit more about the Middle East Treaty Organization and what's to be expected at the UN.
I was going to just answer to Moji Agha inside the comments. I agree with you. I mean, listen, the region, including Iran, is ruled by, let's say, governments that none of us necessarily would like to say we like, okay, in truth. They're one form or another. And by the way, it's going even right-wing everywhere else. Look at Europe and, of course, the United States. But Iranian government and the regime there in Tehran has to reform, or it will actually, like what we've seen elsewhere in the world, collapse in one shape or another, from internal pressures or external. But there is an opportunity forward. And I think that the pressures within Iran are calling for the country to open up, to rejoin the international community. And there's a lot of aspirations that are currently not met. And this is where METO, I will bring it in now, Joseph, is that while we are working on weapons of mass destruction, disarmament in the Middle East, that's not the only place we want to go. We want to bring in human and environmental security into the mix, because without mentioning or focusing or addressing the deep-rooted socioeconomic political factors that are at play locally in Iran, but also across the region, we cannot have a state security either. And the insecurity of our neighbors is our insecurity. And that's the same that I would say to the Israelis and Palestinians, that we cannot bomb out our way into security. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work. We can watch it on live being played in front of our eyes.
Ahmad, thank you. Just to say, I mean, you're closing with basically the concept of common security, which was the foundation for the end of the Cold War. So I encourage people to look at it. We've had a really rich panel. Yeah, I wish we had several hours for it, but I want to thank each of our panelists, and to say that I, and I'm sure others in this conference, will be following up with you for more detailed information, and struggling, as Sharon was suggesting, to find common efforts that we can build on a kind of a global campaign. So thank you very much, and I will surrender the floor here.
Okay, so I am chairing the next panel. I'm Nancy Goldner. I am a member of the Nuclear Disarmament Action Group of Massachusetts Peace Action, and I'd like to introduce our speakers today. First, we will hear from Richard Krushnick. He will be speaking about, well, the theme of the panel, let me back up for a moment, is the costs and dangers of the U.S. nuclear weapons buildup. So first, we're going to hear from Richard Krushnick. Richard writes about the increasing danger of nuclear war and the extent to which the danger stems merely from this military-industrial profit-seeking. He's a member of the MAPA's Nuclear Disarmament Working Group. He also does Latin American support, Nicaraguan community development work, and affordable housing advocacy in Cambridge. I just want to, he's after Richard, David Boris will be speaking. He is a longtime peace activist and he served for 12 years as board president of the Chicago Area Peace Action, CAPA, as it is known. And then finally, Darrell Kimball, who's executive director of the Arms Control Association. And he has done that for more than 2 decades. He's led the organization's research, education, advocacy efforts on a range of issues, including cancellation of new nuclear weapons programs, negotiation and ratification of the 2010 New START agreement, and has also written and spoken extensively about nuclear arms control, disarmament, non-proliferation, and the effects of weapons production, testing, and use. So first, we're going to hear from Richard. Let me just say there'll be 6 minutes to speak. I'll give you a 1-minute warning, and then we will take a few minutes of questions after each person speaks. Go ahead, Richard. Whoop, you're muted, Richard.
I was asked to speak about the Sentinel component of the upgrades and expansion of the U.S. nuclear weapons arsenal, its costs and implications thereof. First cost estimates came out for the Sentinel is to replace the Minuteman and the 400 missile side. Actually, there's 450 missile silos, but only supposedly 400 of them have the Minuteman missiles in them at this time. It's a 50-year-old system, and we are told it needs to be replaced to be effective and functional and so on. This is the land-based component of the triad of the sea-based, air-based, and land-based strategic nuclear weapons arsenal. They were capable of carrying multiple warheads, but because of the agreement with the Russians, they only are supposedly carrying 1 warhead each at this point in time. The first cost estimates for the replacement came out in 2015. And by the time the first serious numbers came out at the awarding of the first contracts in 2020, that estimate was nearly doubled. And we were talking about a total cost for both the production of the missiles, which was somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 billion, about 10 billion for the new warhead, the first actually new warhead that the U.S. would produce in several decades, the W-87-1, about 10 billion. And then with the operating the system, maintaining and operating it over 50 years, the grand total came up to an estimate of $264 billion. That was in 2020, when the first big development contract was awarded to Northrop Grumman. Then in January 2024, the estimate was up to 37%, and in June it was up again, and it was about 81% more than original estimates. And where does that leave us now with the official estimates? We've got an estimate now of about 141 billion for production of 600 and I think it was 59 missiles, to have some spares after you deal with the 450 missile silos. There is no upgraded estimate for the production of the warhead, but my estimate is that the initial estimate of 10 billion is at least half of what it's likely to be. So I'm estimating 20 billion on the warhead production. That gives us 161 billion. And then about 200 billion for the operation and maintenance. That puts us up to 361 billion over the life of the system. But as we know historically, what happens to these estimates, there wasn't an upgraded estimate on the operation and maintenance. I think that's personally likely to be doubled, but let's just say it'll only go up 50%. Well, that puts us at 461 billion over the life of the operation. Now let's go back to just the production of the system. If we're talking about 161 billion for the missiles and the warhead, that's an average of about $16 billion a year over a decade of development and production. Now, let's think, what could we use that money for? $16 billion a year for 10 years. Well, I took a look at what we could use that money for in the health sector. And I discovered that with $16 billion a year, we could pay for 73,000 additional nurses during that year, 10,000, whoops, I can't even read my writing. 10,000 nursing students, 6,000 doctors who focus on prevention, 5,000 community health center doctors, 73,000 nursing assistants, 19,000 non-medical staff, 100 new community health centers, 10 community hospitals. Just think about the 9 Stewart community hospitals that we had in Massachusetts, all of which are either closed or sold to new owners. And a 14% increase, almost $6 billion increase in the annual National Institutes of Health budget. That's just one example of what we could do with the $16 billion a year that we're spending on this system.
1 minute.
What?
1 minute.
1 minute. Okay. Now, there isn't, as far as I know, a single member of Congress or the Senate who is opposing the development of this system. We have our own senators and about 11 other legislators and our own Jim McGovern and about 8 other legislators who are sent a letter, we're talking about the problems of the cost overrun. The Nunn-McCurdy bill requires a review if something increases by the amount of increase that this thing is increased. But that's already been cleared by the executive, and so that's water under the bridge.
Okay, Richard,
Okay, we'll call it there.
and are there questions? I see one hand. Silly question. Keep it brief, please.
Yes, George from Europe, you have well explained the waste of money of this Sentinel. You remember in January, Russian army for first time used the Oreshnik missile, which is not interceptable because it has 10 Mach and it can go until United Kingdom. It covers the whole Europe. If we have this new weapon on the field, which saints makes all these silly weapons like Sentinel in the future?
I must confess I don't quite understand the logic of the question, but the only answer is, let me put it this way. The weapon is very silly because Russia's land-based missiles target our land-based missiles. Our land-based missiles target Russia's land-based missiles. They are the only part of the strategic triad that can be launched almost immediately. The sea-based and the air-based take longer to launch. So they're all on hair trigger. They can all be launched almost immediately, within just a few moments. That's why they're the most dangerous. Because an accident or a miscalculation or misunderstanding can launch them. And if any of them are launched, any of them, then the other side will immediately launch all of theirs because it's launched, it's use them or lose them. It's the most ridiculous system that exists. It only exists to annihilate the other's land-based system. And if any of these missiles are ever used, there will be 20 million at least dead Americans within a year or two. I don't know.
Richard, thank you.
Yeah.
I think I see no other hands. Can we move on then? David Boris.
Thanks, Nancy. Hey, full disclosure, I bet I'm going to be 7 minutes. So just take that into account, would you? So,
Well,
first
I
I
don't know if I can.
want to thank you all so much for asking me to participate on this panel with such esteemed panelists as Mappa's Richard Krushnick and Daryl Kimball, the Arms Control Association. Jonathan asked that I address dangers of the new ICBMs. So I might begin by calling out the utter madness and myopic poor judgment of our government in 2010 when it undertook a 30-year, then $1.5 trillion nuclear modernization program that has triggered what is rapidly becoming an all-out, hell-bent for leather, now trilateral new nuclear arms race. I might point to the hypocrisy of the nation that drafted the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 and obligated itself in Article 6, along with the then 4 other acknowledged nuclear-armed nations, to, quote, pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, unquote. But I do not think we can fully address both the hypocrisy and lunacy of building a completely new class of intercontinental ballistic missiles without questioning the sanity of stockpiling and deploying fixed-in-place nuclear-armed intercontinental ballistic missiles in the first place. Allow me, please, to take a short step back to just a little more than 4 years ago. On Friday, January 22nd, 2021, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force as international law. There was great hope that this could be the catalyst to move us beyond static arms control treaties and perhaps establish momentum for an ultimate path to zero. Lending credence to this hope was that our newly elected President Joe Biden was on record more than a few times stating that he would make a formal no first use declaration that could perhaps be a tiny step toward his predecessor's vision and famous 2009 declaration in Prague. I state clearly and with conviction America's commitment to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Such great hope. And the first step toward such a comprehensive plan, well, that appeared obvious. Of the 3 legs of the US and Russia's nuclear triad, all experts, and I really do mean all experts in nuclear weapons policy, agree that the most dangerous and unstable leg of the triad are fixed-in-place ICBMs. They are, by their very fixed-in-place status, completely vulnerable to a preemptive first strike, so vulnerable that they're often referred to in nuclear policy circles as a sponge, meant to absorb an enemy's first strike. Of course, the illogic of that is that if you wanted to have a land-based retaliatory capacity, you would need to launch those missiles between the time of first warning and the moment of impact, about 26 minutes. Given the 10 minutes it takes from receiving the go code to actual launch, plus the 6 minutes that it takes to fully verify incoming missiles, you're left with about 10 minutes for the US president, who has sole authority to launch those weapons, to decide, as the term is used, to use them or lose them. And thus the fate of the world, or at least 90% of the 8 billion souls that the planet houses, hangs in the balance of those 10 minutes, and more importantly, in the balance of the mental, emotional, and spiritual stability of one human being. What was not fully understood in 1978, when Air Force Chief of Staff General Lou Allen coined the term nuclear sponge, was the concept of nuclear winter, explained by atmospheric scientist Richard Turco in 1983, whereupon the 400 to 800 outbound thermonuclear missiles headed for enemy silos and cities would create a firestorm that would blot out 70% of the sunlight reaching the ground and effectively make it impossible to grow crops for 3 years or more. So those unfortunates who survived the original searing effects of thousands of blasts and the pursuant radiation poisoning would simply die of starvation over the course of the next 2 to 3 years. This fact led the brilliant scientist and author Carl Sagan to remark of a thermonuclear exchange, the living will envy the dead. And so the obvious first steps were to, 1, eliminate the program scheduled to replace all 400 Minuteman missiles, which are the land-based leg of the triad, and 2, begin to dismantle the existing land-based leg, and in so doing, send a clear signal to a nervous China and our old nuclear adversary, Russia, that we meant to make good on the spirit of Barack Obama's 2009 Prague speech and begin to inject some mature sanity into the paradigm of arms control. Unfortunately, none of the above has occurred, and we've wasted 4 years now and further compromised our credibility with the world community regarding our commitment to protect the lives of the world, especially the over 6 billion who live in nations that do not possess nuclear weapons. Richard's already related the financial boondoggle that this has become, and it appears that no amount of program mismanagement and cost overruns seem egregious enough to stop the madness. In the last year of his life, I heard Daniel Ellsberg say on more than one occasion, the possibility of a nuclear detonation by design, miscalculation, or accident, is not zero. It's not even close to zero. And we know that the universal laws of physics and mathematics will tell you that anything that is not impossible is indeed inevitable. Our 75-year history of nuclear weapons possession is replete with example after example of misunderstandings, accidents, and Cold War fear where we just barely escaped a major exchange of nuclear weapons.
David, 1 minute.
Thank you. And now we increase the opportunities for misjudgment by a full 50% as we add China to the mix, with whom we have zero history of nuclear arms treaties or negotiations. By a stroke of luck or the right person being in the right position to exercise proper judgment in the moment, or by cooler heads at the top restraining their initial instinct, we have avoided the apocalypse. But that cannot be counted on to last forever. I took my degree from the University of Nevada in Las Vegas, and I took a variety of courses in the mathematics of casino games. I must tell you, I know a little bit about winning streaks. They don't last forever. It's a mathematical impossibility. We have been the beneficiaries of a fantastically long winning streak with respect to nuclear weapons. It won't last forever. And if we continue to add bullets to the chamber of the revolver that we hold to our heads and the heads of the world population in this lunatic game of nuclear Russian roulette, our luck will run out and we won't get a second chance to get this right. In the opening of the 2003 movie, The Fog of War, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara
David,
says,
you've run out of time here.
quote, this is my last quote. The conventional wisdom in warfare is you don't make the same mistake twice. Learn from your mistakes, but there will be no learning period with nuclear weapons. You make one mistake and you're going to destroy nations, McNamara said. And now we know that we will destroy more than just the belligerent participants. We will functionally incapacitate human civilization across the planet, and we won't get a second chance. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions? Not seeing any hands. It's hard to talk about with what you've just said. Very stark.
It's a little stark.
But it speaks to the need, the incredible need to talk to each other. No questions. Here's a question from Art Milholland.
My question is this. It seems much of the so-called wisdom of the nuclear arms race is driven by the people who make the arms and get the profits. why in the world should we believe that they actually could ever even build these Sentinel missiles, for example, when they can't build a decent aircraft carrier or the F-35? They haven't succeeded in making any complex weapons. They succeed only in creating incredible expense. So I believe everything Dr. Boris said is super 100% correct. But we're
I give
falling
them
for
a
this
chance
idea
to
that the
respond.
companies can actually deliver on what they promise.
Okay, David.
The promise is to redirect hundreds of billions of dollars away from human needs and into the pockets of a narrow few. I mean, we could do a whole other 8-hour seminar to talk about what neoliberal economics has brought us since the election of Ronald Reagan and possibly before that. I mean, it's incredibly disturbing. But beyond the money, this is civilization's survival. And the fact that we cannot come to an understanding that there literally is no such thing as deterrence. There's only a giant crap table. And we just roll the dice once a week, once a month, once a year, and we hope they don't come up snake eyes. I mean, it is as frightening as it could be. I think the bigger question is, why did we understand this in the 80s? And there's no understanding of it in the general. 1 million people in Central Park in 1982. We got 10 people to the lecture at Harvard. At Harvard, a lecture by an MIT professor about the dangers of a nuclear conflict in Taiwan, and 10 people show up. That's the bigger question, I think.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Louise?
Okay, my question is about psychic numbing, about why people in general are so freaked out that they don't even realize that they're freaked out. I mean, it's like I work a lot on trying to get information about a nuclear war, the possibility of total destruction, into the press, into having TV, newspapers, whomever shows up to put it in the paper, put it in so people can see it. And it's so hard to do that. I think people are so horrified that it's really just hard to get any kind of like real realization. I mean, it really.
Louise, do you have a question for David?
Yeah, the question is, how can we get through to people so they understand and they know that they can do something about it?
If I had that answer, I would probably be the head of the United Nations, right?
Yes, you
I
would.
think it's a really difficult question to answer. It's tied up in the way we consume information, in the fact that there are no trusted sources of information. This is not just the United States problem. This is all over the world, right? That we've siloed information. We thought we were democratizing it, and we didn't. This is the unforeseen effect. Yeah, I think it's hard. And I think we're partially the victims of a 75-year run where we really haven't had, and the close calls don't get advertised. Other than the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's no conversation about a close call. And they should be advertised.
I think we are going to carry on with Daryl Kimball. Daryl.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. It's good to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. This is an important conversation. I've been asked to talk about what to expect from the Trump administration 2.0 on the possibility of a nuclear weapons buildup and a global arms race. So let me talk about three main things about what we can expect with respect to building up beyond the existing nuclear weapons modernization plan, the difficulties and the prospects regarding advancing nuclear arms control and disarmament diplomacy, and the issue of the future of U.S. nuclear testing policy, which is also something that is possibly in play in Trump 2.0. So as we've been discussing, the risk of nuclear war is possibly greater than at any time since the end of the Cold War. It is difficult to predict what Donald Trump is going to do in his second administration on these issues, since his positions were hardly explained, let alone debated during the 2024 campaign cycle. But we're starting to get some more data that can allow us to design strategies that engage the public, that resist some of the directions that Trump could go in, and to redirect some of his instincts that may be positive in a more constructive direction. So, as we've been discussing, all of the nuclear armed states are spending tens of billions of dollars on modernizing their arsenals. Talks on nuclear arms control remain stalled. Mainly, the US and Russia have been the key channel there. It's been stalled for over a decade. And the other key point of information is the last agreement limiting the US and Russian nuclear arsenals, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, is going to expire on February 5, 2026, without a chance for another extension. So that means that, partly due to the fact that China, as we heard earlier, is building up its arsenal also in response to concerns about the United States' conventional and nuclear capabilities in Asia, we're facing a potential area of unconstrained nuclear competition. So what we're going to see from congressional Republicans, the authors of Project 2025, and likely Donald Trump's appointees of the Defense Department, is a plan and proposals for spending even more than the current nuclear weapons modernization plan that has been underway for over a decade, which will cost at least $756 billion over the next 10 years. And if there is a buildup beyond that, the price tag will go up exponentially. So what we're seeing from Congress are proposals for augmenting US nuclear forces. There was a congressional commission on the US strategic posture that released a report in late 2023. They proposed that the United States should prepare to deploy the Sentinel ICBM with multiple warheads, increase the planned number of deployed nuclear-armed air-launched cruise missiles on strategic bombers, increase the planned number of B-21 bombers, increase the planned production of the new Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines, pursue the feasibility of fielding some portion of the future ICBM force in a road mobile configuration, develop plans and procedures to reconvert submarine launchers for missiles and B-52 bombers for use before the New START treaty expires, and to put the US B-52 fleet on continuous alert status, meaning they would be in the air with nuclear weapons 24/7. And most worryingly, from my perspective, is to prepare to upload some or all of the reserve warheads on the existing ICBMs, the Minuteman IIIs, and submarine-launched ballistic missile systems. So the United States and Russia could increase, almost double their existing force levels, which are around 1,600, 1,700 deployed warheads on long-range systems. They could probably double that in 2 to 3 years by this uploading procedure. And that would reverse 35 years of Russian-US reductions. It's not necessary to deter nuclear attack by Russia or China. It would divert resources from other human needs. And of course, if the US did this, Russia and China would match any US increase. So we need to be...
1 minute.
Okay, I'm going to need 2.5 minutes, please.
Oh, carry on. Then.
Okay, let me just... So we need to be making the case that we don't need more deployed nuclear weapons. This is going to be a major issue in Congress. There's legislation that will be forthcoming from Congressman Foster and Markey on this subject that we should look out for. The second part of this is how can we advance nuclear arms control diplomacy, because that can help push back against a buildup by the US, Russia, and China. Last week, interestingly enough, Trump said he wants to hold talks with Russia and China about reducing nuclear stockpiles. Quote, "We want to see if we can denuclearize, and I think that is very possible." He claimed to have been close to a three-way deal with Russia and China on nuclear arms control in 2020. He was not. His memory, of course, is a little disturbed. Negotiating with the Russians at any time is very difficult. Negotiations with China, there's not much of a history. So as a first step, one of the things that we can be pushing and Congress can be pushing is a simple, straightforward, informal deal with President Putin that could be discussed in the context of what happens in Ukraine, pledging each side not to exceed the current limit set by New START on their strategic nuclear weapon systems, as long as the other side does not, does the same. That would buy time for more formal talks on a more comprehensive nuclear arms control framework involving long-range, intermediate, and tactical nuclear weapon systems, and forestall a costly arms race nobody can win. And again, this idea is part of this legislation I mentioned that is going to be reintroduced next year by Congressman Foster in the House and Congressman Markey in the Senate. Finally, let me just note that the Trump administration has not formally said they want to renew nuclear testing, but people who are advising Trump have proposed two things. Trump's former national security advisor, Robert O'Brien, last summer suggested a straightforward resumption of U.S. nuclear testing, which of course is not wise. It's not technically or militarily necessary. And we have Project 2025 and a number of people who are going into the administration who are proposing that the United States should reduce the time necessary to resume testing from the current 36-month period to 6 months. We're likely going to see in the next budget request from Trump to Congress a proposal for an additional $50 to $100 million for activities at the Nevada National Security Site, that's what they call it now, the former test site, to reduce the readiness period. This is also something we need to be alert for, and we need to be working together to oppose at the local and state level, particularly in Nevada, and there's already a campaign against this, and in Congress. So these are three key areas that we need to be paying attention to, we need to be active on, we need to be coordinated on. There's already a great deal of NGO activity focused on this work, and those of you who are interested in joining us and helping, we're more than happy to connect you to the working group meetings in that area. So let me stop there and take your questions. Thanks.
See a question from Jan.
My question is this. Are we spending more money on our armaments than the other countries? For example, a U-238 reinforced tank from the United States will cost more of taxpayer money than if it were built in, if the Russians were building it for their arsenal, or China.
It's hard to calculate apples to apples costs. I mean, the defense production systems, procurement processes are different. The regulations are different. The reality is that the US, China, and Russia are all building up not just their nuclear capabilities, modernizing the existing systems in the case of the Chinese building new land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, but throughout the entire scope of their militaries. So, world military expenditures are going up across the board, as the Stockholm Peace Research Institute documents.
I have a question now from Richard. We're running short on time, so please make it very brief.
Okay. I haven't heard this mentioned, but during the Biden administration, and perhaps even before that, the U.S. has been building up its weaponry, I'm sure nuclear too, from South Korea down to Diego Garcia. In case you don't know where that is, that's a big base the U.S. has on an island in the Indian Ocean. And I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Well, Diego Garcia has been a U.S. Air Force base for a long time.
Right.
I mean, one thing I would point to that I think is actually more relevant to some of the issues we're dealing with today is there are 3 nuclear weapons free zone treaties, the African, South Pacific, and Central Asia zones that the U.S. Senate could and should consider. The nuclear armed states have all signed protocols to these zones that pledge to respect the zones and that pledge the nuclear armed states not to use or threaten nuclear weapons against these zone states. These protocols are sitting in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee now, and they have been for over a decade. That's also something we should be bringing up with our members of Congress. That has some impact on what happens in Diego Garcia and what kinds of weapons can be transited in that area, which is part of the African nuclear weapons free zone.
Right, but that's along the coast.
Wait,
of
wait,
China.
wait, wait,
Why-
no, we
that's
can't
why
do
I'd
that, Richard. We can't carry on with your question. We will take another question from someone by telephone. You are the next person, 17773.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
We can hear
Jake
you.
is my name, calling from Chicago. Got 2 brief questions. Number one, I thought we stopped nuclear testing several years ago. Why are we testing again? That's number one. And number two, what you mentioned a treaty that expired. I think there's several treaties that have expired. Is that correct?
Just to be clear, I mean, what I was saying is that the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, the last remaining U.S.-Russian treaty regulating their nuclear stockpiles, will expire in about 370 days. We have halted nuclear testing. It's been that's one of the great triumphs of the nuclear disarmament movement through the years. The U.S. stopped testing in 1992. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1996 has solidified the global prohibition on nuclear testing. The North Koreans are the only country that have conducted nuclear tests in the 21st century. But the Trump administration may reduce the time necessary to resume testing by the U.S. Some in the Trump administration circle are proposing a resumption of testing. All of this is really not about some technical need to prove the reliability of a warhead. It is all about trying to intimidate the Russians and the Chinese and to show that Trump is, peace through strength. And so it's something, that if this pops up, and I think this will in the next 1 or 2 months, we need to stand up and resist, because this would be an enormous setback to the global nuclear risk reduction and disarmament regime.
I think we have concluded our time for this panel. Thank you all, both people asking questions and our incredibly knowledgeable and at times scaring, a bit frightening panel of talk here. So at this point, we're going to take a 10-minute break, I believe is on the schedule. So we will be back in 10 minutes.